I bought a $5 million villa on the oceanfront. As soon as my son-in-law found out, he called me. We're on our way to you. There will be 20 of us. Prepare beds, towels, slippers, food. We will be staying for 2 weeks. We will be there in 30 minutes, so hurry up, old man. I smiled and made a plan. I am Lawrence, 75 years old, and somehow still paying the price for the mistakes of the people I love. As a self-made logistics magnate who spent 4 decades turning a single rusted delivery truck into a nationwide freight empire, I finally escaped the corporate grind to claim my peace. But peace is a fragile thing when your family harbors a parasite. Last Friday, I was standing on the pristine cedar deck of my newly purchased oceanfront sanctuary in Monterey, California, breathing in the salt air and watching the morning fog roll off the Pacific. Growing up with nothing taught me the value of every single dollar and every drop of sweat. My sprawling, modern villa, with its floor-to-ceiling glass walls, infinity pool, and state-of-the-art smart home technology was my fortress, a reward for a lifetime of missed birthdays and sleepless nights. I designed it to be a quiet place for me, and eventually a secure inheritance for my daughter Rachel. Rachel is my only child, a brilliant but relentlessly optimistic woman who unfortunately inherited her late mother's tendency to see the good in absolutely everyone. That fatal flaw led her straight into the arms of Trent. My phone vibrated in my pocket, shattering the quiet rhythm of the crashing waves. I pulled it out and saw Trent's name flashing on the screen. Usually, I would let it go to voicemail, but a strange instinct urged me to answer. I swiped the screen and lifted the phone to my ear, expecting a request for another loan or some fabricated emergency. Instead, what I heard was the chaotic background noise of highway driving and loud, obnoxious music. "Lawrence, listen to me," Trent barked, his voice dripping with an arrogance that immediately made my jaw clench. "We are on our way to you right now. There will be 20 of us. Prepare the guest beds, get out the fresh towels, find some slippers, and make sure the fridge is completely stocked. We will be staying for 2 weeks. We are about 30 minutes out, so hurry up, old man, and get things ready." For a full 10 seconds, I stood perfectly still. The sheer, unadulterated disrespect echoed in my ears. He did not ask if it was a good time. He did not ask for permission to bring 20 strangers into my private home. He issued orders as if I were a minimum-wage hotel concierge and he was the VIP guest. He called me old man with a sneer that suggested my only remaining purpose on this earth was to serve him. My blood boiled hot and fast. The instinct of the man who used to wrestle diesel engines and confront aggressive union bosses roared to life, urging me to tell him that if he even approached my driveway, I would have him arrested for trespassing. But I did not scream. I did not curse. 40 years of ruthless business negotiations taught me that when an opponent reveals their absolute worst traits, you do not interrupt them. You let them walk blindly into the light so you can see exactly what you are dealing with. I took a slow, deep breath of the ocean air, forcing my heart rate to steady. I pictured Rachel's face and knew that a direct confrontation would only force her to defend her husband. I needed to expose him so thoroughly that she would have no choice but to see the truth. I pasted a cheerful tone onto my face and let it bleed into my voice. "Of course, Trent," I said smoothly. "The gates will be open. I will make sure everything is prepared for your arrival. Drive safely." I hung up the phone and looked out at the vast ocean. My mind shifted immediately from peaceful retirement to tactical warfare. Trent thought he was dealing with a senile push over an obsolete relic who could be bullied into submission. He was about to learn a very painful lesson about respecting the man who built the castle he was trying to invade. Exactly 31 minutes later, the massive iron gates at the top of my driveway swung open. I stood on the front steps with my hands clasped behind my back, watching the spectacle approach. A fleet of vehicles roared down the winding coastal driveway, led by a rented luxury SUV that was far beyond Trent's actual financial means. The tires kicked up gravel, scratching the immaculate pavement I had just had laid the week before. The vehicles came to a screeching halt near the fountain, and the doors flew open. Trent stepped out first. He was dressed in designer clothes that looked brand new, practically radiating the desperate energy of a man trying to project wealth he did not possess. He puffed out his chest and marched up the stone steps, spreading his arms wide and slapping me hard on the shoulder as if we were fraternity brothers reunited after a long summer. "Lawrence," he announced loudly, making sure everyone piling out of the cars could hear him. "Look at this place. Absolutely incredible. I knew you would not mind hosting us." I kept my expression perfectly neutral, offering a polite but distant smile. "You mentioned on the phone that there were 20 of you, Trent. What exactly is the occasion that brings such a crowd to my home on a Friday morning?" Trent leaned in close, adopting a conspiratorial tone that reeked of cheap cologne and expensive lies. He lowered his voice, pitching it to sound like an exhausted but visionary CEO. "Lawrence, this is a massive moment for me. This is a crucial investor retreat for my new tech startup. These guys are top-tier venture capitalists, angel investors, and silent partners. I needed a venue that screamed success to close the seed funding round." He paused, studying my face to see if I was buying his performance. When I merely nodded, he played his ultimate trump card. He brought up my daughter. "Rachel practically begged me to do this here, Lawrence. She said her dad is a business legend, and that you would absolutely love to help me secure this funding. She told me you would be honored to host the people who are going to make her husband a millionaire." The mention of Rachel's name felt like a knife twisting in my ribs. He was weaponizing her love for me, using her as a shield to justify his home invasion. I knew for a fact Rachel had not begged him to do this, because Rachel would have called me herself. Trent was lying straight to my face, weaving a narrative where rejecting him meant rejecting my daughter's dreams. "I understand," I said, keeping my voice measured and calm. "An investor retreat. That requires a lot of focus and professionalism." "Exactly." Trent beamed, thinking he had completely won me over. "We are going to be quiet, respectful, and strictly business-focused. Just a mastermind session, Lawrence. High-level synergy and corporate strategizing. You will not even know we are here. We will just use the pool, the entertainment rooms, and the main kitchen. You can just relax and let us work." He clapped me on the shoulder one more time and turned back to his entourage, shouting instructions about where to carry the bags. I stood on the steps and played the role of the supportive, naive father-in-law. I welcomed them with open arms, inviting the viper directly into the nest. I gave him the rope, and now all I had to do was wait for him to tie the knot. As the investors began unloading their vehicles, the plausible lie Trent had just spun began to unravel right before my eyes. A man who spent his life analyzing shipping manifests and evaluating supply chain personnel learns how to read people very quickly. The men pouring out of the cars did not look like venture capitalists or angel investors. There was not a single tailored suit, briefcase, or laptop bag in sight. Instead, these men wore cheap tracksuits, oversized hoodies, and heavy boots. Several of them had visible neck tattoos and thick gold chains that looked more like brass knuckles than jewelry. They carried themselves with an aggressive swagger, eyes darting around the property, taking inventory of my sculptures, my vehicles, and my electronics. They looked at my home the way a pack of wolves looks at a wounded deer. More alarmingly, they were not carrying presentation materials or corporate documents. They were hauling out massive coolers, industrial-sized speakers, and heavy cardboard boxes filled with cheap liquor. One of them dropped a box on my pristine driveway, and the sound of clinking glass echoed loudly against the stone. Trent, completely ignoring the mess, marched right past me and into the grand foyer. He did not bother to take his shoes off, tracking dirt across the custom hardwood floors. He looked around the massive living space, pointing at different rooms and assigning them to his friends. "I need the master suite," he demanded, pointing a finger directly at my bedroom doors. "The CEO needs the best view to close the deals. The energy up there is exactly what I need to finalize the contracts. The rest of you grab whatever rooms are left." I watched him essentially commandeer my personal sanctuary. Yet I maintained my silence. I needed to see how deep this rot went. Trent then turned his attention back to me, pulling me away from the crowd into the shadow of the hallway. His demeanor shifted from boisterous frat boy to something much more calculated and nervous. "Lawrence," he whispered, looking over his shoulder to ensure none of his friends were listening. "A quick question about the logistics of this place. Where exactly do the security cameras point? Are the property lines completely private, or can the neighbors see into the backyard?" I raised an eyebrow, studying the beads of sweat forming on his temples. Why would venture capitalists care about the camera angles, Trent? "Confidentiality," he replied far too quickly. "Corporate espionage is a real threat, Lawrence. We are dealing with proprietary algorithms and non-disclosure agreements. We cannot have anyone snooping. Do the local police patrol this far down the coast? Is the wireless network fully encrypted?" My intuition, which had been humming since the phone call, flared into a blazing siren. This was not a tech startup retreat. No legitimate business meeting requires absolute isolation away from police patrols and security cameras. These questions were not born of corporate caution. They were born of criminal paranoia. Trent was hiding something incredibly dangerous. The way his eyes darted to the heavy duffel bags his friends were carrying. The way he sweat in the cool ocean breeze. The way he desperately needed to know the blind spots of my property. I recognized the look of a drowning man trying to pull someone else under to save himself. He was a hustler running out of time, and he had brought his problems directly to my doorstep. I knew right then that if I threw him out, I would never find out what he was truly involved in. He would just take his mess back to my daughter, and Rachel would be the one to suffer the consequences. I needed to take complete invisible control of the situation. I needed to watch him when he thought nobody was looking. I let out a sudden sharp gasp and grabbed my lower back, leaning heavily against the oak-paneled wall. I contorted my face into a mask of severe, sudden pain, gritting my teeth and breathing shallowly. "Lawrence, what is it?" Trent asked, stepping back slightly, his eyes wide. "My back," I groaned, gripping the wall tighter. The stress of the sudden arrival, it triggered an old injury from my trucking days. My sciatic nerve just pinched. I cannot even stand up straight. I hobbled toward a nearby chair and collapsed into it, putting on a performance worthy of an Academy Award. Trent watched me, his initial shock rapidly transforming into poorly concealed joy. The corners of his mouth twitched upward before he forced a look of fake sympathy. "Oh, that is terrible news, Lawrence," he said, attempting to sound concerned, but failing to hide his relief. "What can we do? Do you need a doctor?" No, I wheezed, waving him off. "I just need intensive physical therapy immediately. There is a health spa a few towns over in Carmel that specializes in this. I need to go spend the weekend there, floating in their thermal pools and getting spinal massages. But I feel terrible leaving you here during your big investor meetings. I do not want to get in the way of your funding round." Trent practically vibrated with excitement. "Do not even worry about us, Lawrence. Your health is the absolute priority. Take your time. Spend the whole week at the spa if you need to. Do not rush back on our account. We will watch the place. We will treat it like it is our own." "I am sure you will," I murmured, keeping my head down so he could not see the cold fury in my eyes. I slowly stood up, faking a severe limp, and packed a small overnight bag. Trent hovered nearby, eagerly ushering me toward the garage. I climbed into my sedan, offering him one last pained smile before I started the engine. I drove down the long, winding driveway and watched the massive iron gates close behind me in the rearview mirror. But I did not drive to Carmel. I did not go to a health spa. I drove about a mile down the coastal highway, waiting until the villa was entirely out of sight. Then I executed a sharp U-turn. I drove back toward my property, but instead of approaching the main gates, I pulled onto a hidden dirt access road that cut through the dense cypress trees on the lower hillside of the cliff. This road led to a small, soundproofed caretaker cottage, tucked completely out of sight from the main villa above. When I purchased the property, I had completely renovated this cottage, outfitting it as a secure storm shelter and a private office. I parked my car in the concealed garage and unlocked the heavy steel door of the cottage. The air inside was cool and still. I walked over to the main desk and powered up the command center. When I bought the $5 million estate, I did not just buy luxury, I bought absolute security. I had a team of former military contractors install a comprehensive smart home surveillance network. There were hidden high-definition cameras in every hallway, every common room, and every exterior angle of the property. There were invisible microphones embedded in the smart speakers. I typed in my encrypted password and hit enter. The massive wall of monitors flared to life, illuminating the dark cottage with dozens of live camera feeds. I could see the driveway, the pool, the living room, and the kitchen. I clicked a button, and the audio feeds unmuted, filling my hidden bunker with the sound of Trent and his friends cheering inside my home. I leaned back in my leather chair, crossing my arms over my chest. Trent thought the old man was gone. He thought he had the castle all to himself. He had no idea that he had just locked himself inside a cage and handed me the key. I poured myself a cup of black coffee, sat back in the glow of the monitors, and waited for the real show to begin. The moment the heavy iron gates clicked shut at the end of the driveway, the atmosphere on my surveillance monitors shifted completely. Sitting in the dimly lit command center of the caretaker cottage, I watched the high-definition screens capture the immediate death of Trent's polite businessman persona. He stood on the front steps watching the road for a full minute to ensure my car was truly out of sight. When he was finally satisfied, he turned back to the mob of track-suited men and let out a loud, piercing whistle. The tension in the group evaporated instantly, replaced by a vulgar, chaotic energy that made my stomach churn. "Bring it all in!" Trent shouted, his voice booming through the hidden microphones I had installed in the portico. "The old fossil is gone for the weekend. The place is ours." The men erupted into cheers that sounded more like a pack of wild dogs being let off their leashes. They rushed to the trunks of their vehicles, dragging out more heavy coolers, cardboard boxes of cheap liquor, and massive duffel bags that clanked with an unsettling metallic weight. I watched in cold silence as they trampled up the pristine stone steps, their heavy, muddy boots scraping against the imported Italian marble of the foyer. I had spent months selecting those stones, but to these men they were nothing but a floor to be ruined. They flooded into this grand living room, a space I had carefully designed to capture the serene beauty of the Pacific Ocean. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the crashing waves, but Trent's friends paid absolutely no attention to the ocean. They cared only about the opulent furniture and the expensive liquor cabinet I had forgotten to lock. One of the men, a towering figure with a thick neck tattoo, threw his heavy duffel bag directly onto my custom-made white leather sofa. I could almost hear the leather groan under the weight. Another man kicked off his boots and propped his dirty bare feet onto the antique glass coffee table, lighting a thick cigar right in the middle of the room. The smoke immediately drifted toward the high ceilings, triggering a silent alert on my environmental monitoring system. But the true desecration happened when Trent led a group of 4 men up the floating glass staircase toward the master wing. I switched my primary monitor to the bedroom, my jaw clenching so tight my teeth began to ache. My bedroom was my ultimate sanctuary, containing photographs of my late wife, books I had collected over a lifetime, and priceless heirlooms from my travels. Trent kicked the double mahogany doors open with such force that they bounced violently against the wall stops. He strutted into the room like a conquering warlord. "This is the VIP lounge, boys," he announced, gesturing broadly to the sprawling space. I watched as he walked over to my cherry wood dresser and carelessly shoved a framed photograph of Rachel and me aside to make room for a bottle of whiskey. He then jumped onto my king-sized bed, his shoes still on, bouncing on the mattress, while his friends laughed and unpacked their bags on the plush rugs. He was violating my most private space with a casual arrogance that was almost breathtaking to witness. I pressed a button on the console, isolating the audio feed for the master suite, ensuring I captured every single syllable spoken. "Come on, Trent, let's get the party started," one of his friends yelled, tossing him a plastic cup filled with amber liquid. "We have a lot of work to do tonight." Trent caught the cup and hopped down from the bed, walking over to the massive window overlooking the sea. He took a long drink and turned back to his friends, a sneer twisting his features. "Can you believe how easy that was?" he laughed, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. The old man practically handed me the keys. All it took was a little mention of his precious daughter and a fake business pitch, and he ran off to a spa like a frightened turtle. The men chuckled, pouring their own drinks. "Is he really that clueless?" one of them asked a man with a scarred eyebrow who was currently digging through my bedside table drawers. Trent scoffed loudly. "Lawrence is a dinosaur. He spent his whole life building some boring logistics company, and now his brain is turning to mush. He is nothing but a senile ATM for me and Rachel. He thinks he is so smart sitting in his giant empty house, but he has no idea what the real world is like anymore. He is weak. We are going to bleed this place dry, and he will just smile and write another check because he is terrified of losing his daughter." I watched on the kitchen camera as they ravaged my walk-in pantry, tearing open packages and throwing food on the floor. I watched on the patio camera as they dragged my expensive lounge chairs to the edge of the infinity pool, spilling dark, sticky drinks into the crystal-clear water. The house was filled with deafening bass-heavy music that vibrated through the hidden microphones, distorting the audio feeds. But my surveillance system utilized military-grade noise cancellation software. By sliding a few digital sliders on my control panel, I could filter out the heavy bass and isolate the human voices, allowing me to hear every drunken boast, every crass joke, and every nervous whisper. Yet beneath the surface of the loud music and the chaotic drinking, I noticed a specific pattern. The men were not just partying, they were waiting. The duffel bags they had brought in remained unopened, heavily guarded by the most intimidating members of the group. Trent was drinking heavily, but his eyes were constantly darting to the grandfather clock in the hallway. He paced back and forth across the desecrated living room, checking his phone every few minutes with a feverish intensity. The swagger he displayed in the master bedroom was slowly being replaced by a gnawing, desperate anxiety. I watched him pour another drink, his hands shaking slightly as he spilled whiskey onto the marble countertop. I leaned closer to the monitors, my eyes tracing the lines of panic on his face. He had called me an old man. He had called me weak and senile. He assumed that because I lived a quiet, retired life, I had lost the teeth that allowed me to conquer an industry. I was about to learn that an old lion is still a lion, and you do not walk into his den, start breaking his bones, and expect to walk out alive. The destruction of my property was painful to watch, but it was a necessary sacrifice. It was the bait that kept the rats occupied while I built the ultimate trap. I took a sip of my cold coffee, keeping my eyes locked on the screens, waiting patiently for the true investors to arrive. The loud, rhythmic thumping of the bass from the living room was beginning to vibrate through the floorboards of the main house. I could see the vibrations rippling the surface of the pool water on my exterior cameras. But my attention was no longer on the mob of track-suited men destroying my living room. My eyes were locked on a single screen in the upper left corner of my command center. Trent had separated himself from the pack. He slipped out of the master bedroom, leaving his friends to their cheap liquor and crude jokes. He moved quickly and quietly down the carpeted hallway, looking over his shoulder twice before slipping into my private study. He closed the heavy, solid oak door behind him and leaned against it, exhaling a long, shaky breath. He thought he was finally alone. He thought the thick walls of the study would shield him from the chaos of his friends and the prying eyes of the world. I had no idea that he had just walked into the most heavily monitored room in the entire villa. I leaned forward in my leather chair, my hands resting on the cool metal of the control console. I slid the audio mixer controls down for the living room and the patio, silencing the deafening party. I then amplified the audio feed for the study. The microphone hidden discreetly inside the smoke detector above my mahogany desk picked up the sound of Trent's ragged breathing. He was practically hyperventilating. He walked over to my desk and gripped the edges, his knuckles turning white. He stared blindly out the reinforced window into the dark ocean night. Then his phone began to vibrate. It did not ring with a standard melody. It produced a harsh, relentless buzzing sound against the wooden surface of the desk where he had dropped it. Trent stared at the glowing screen as if it were a venomous snake preparing to strike. He let it buzz for 5 agonizing seconds, wiping the sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand before he finally snatched it up and pressed it to his ear. "Yes, I am here," he said. His voice was completely stripped of the arrogant frat boy swagger he had paraded around my driveway. It was a thin, reedy whisper. It was the voice of a man standing on the edge of a very high cliff. I turned the volume dial up slightly, leaning closer to the speakers. I could not hear the voice on the other end of the line, but I did not need to. Trent's desperate responses painted a terrifyingly clear picture. I know, we are behind schedule," Trent stammered, pacing back and forth across the Persian rug. "But I did exactly what I promised. I secured the venue. The place is completely empty. The old man is gone for the weekend. He is completely clueless. I have the entire property to myself." He paused, listening to the caller. His face contorted in a grimace of pure panic. He ran a trembling hand through his hair, pulling at the roots. "Please, you have to give me 2 more days," he begged. "I am begging you. Do not send anyone to my house. My wife is there. You promised you would leave Rachel out of this if I provided the location." Hearing my daughter's name spill from his lips, in the context of a physical threat, made my blood run absolutely cold. The calculated, detached observation I had maintained up until this point shattered entirely. A primal protective rage flared deep in my chest. He had brought a threat so severe into my daughter's life that he was begging for her safety over a phone call in my stolen study. I forced myself to breathe, taking slow, measured breaths to keep my mind sharp. I needed every piece of information he was about to reveal. "I have the collateral," Trent pleaded, stopping his pacing to lean heavily against my bookshelves. "The collateral is fully secured, I swear to you. This place is worth at least $5 million on the open market, and I have access to all the deeds and the financial cabinets. The property lines are completely private. There are no neighbors to hear anything. The police do not patrol this private coastal road. We are totally isolated. It is the perfect staging ground for your operation." Trent listened again, his eyes squeezing shut, as if he were bracing for a physical blow. When he spoke again, his voice was cracking. "Just let me host the game tomorrow night." He whined, his shoulders slumping in defeat. "The high-stakes game will cover all the interest I owe you. I invited all the heavy hitters. They are bringing millions in liquid cash. You can take your cut directly from the tables, and the collateral will cover the principal. Just keep your men calm and let the event play out. I am giving you the perfect isolated venue, just like you demanded." Trent stayed on the line for another agonizing minute, muttering frantic agreements and desperate promises. "Yes, tomorrow night. Yes, the cash will be on the tables. Yes, you have my absolute word." When the call finally disconnected, Trent let the phone slip from his fingers. It dropped onto the thick rug with a soft thud. He collapsed into my leather desk chair, burying his face in his hands. He let out a pathetic, muffled sob that vibrated through the hidden microphones. The man who had mocked me as a senile relic just an hour ago was now crying in my chair, paralyzed by the consequences of his own catastrophic failures. I watched as Trent slowly lifted his head from his hands. His moment of weeping panic was over, replaced by a grim, determined survival instinct. He wiped his eyes and began pulling at the handles of my mahogany desk. He found them locked. He cursed under his breath and stood up, moving toward the filing cabinets in the corner of the room. He was looking for the property deeds, the ownership titles, the very documents he intended to use as his sacrificial collateral. I was trying to steal my home out from under me to pay for his sins. My hands moved over the control console, locking the cameras onto his every movement. He could pull at those locked drawers all night, but he would never find the physical deeds. I kept all critical ownership documents secured in an impenetrable bank vault downtown. But the fact that he was actively searching for them, confirming his intent to forge or steal his way out of his debt, meant that observation time was officially over. I kept my eyes locked on the monitor, watching Trent desperately rattle the handles of my filing cabinets. My hands moved instinctively over the smooth surface of my secure phone, dialing a number I knew by heart. Wallace was not just a corporate attorney. He was an apex predator in a tailored suit. For 3 decades, he had been the architect of my legal defenses, the man who dismantled hostile takeovers before they even reached the boardroom. We had fought side by side in the trenches of the logistics industry, crushing corrupt competitors and shielding my empire from opportunistic vultures. He did not ask questions. He simply executed orders with a chilling efficiency that left my rivals bankrupt and begging for mercy. The phone rang exactly twice before his voice came through the speaker, crisp and devoid of any sleepiness, despite the late hour. "Lawrence," he said plainly, "what is the situation?" I did not bother with pleasantries. "Wallace, I need you to initiate a total shadow audit, and I need it running tonight." There was a brief pause on the line, the sound of a leather-bound notebook opening. "Give me the target, Lawrence." I kept my voice low, my eyes tracing Trent's erratic movements on the screen. "It is Trent, my son-in-law. I need you to rip open every single financial record attached to his name. He claims he has a tech startup. I want to know if it actually exists, who the stakeholders are, and exactly how much capital it has burned through. I want a complete autopsy of his personal finances. Dig into his offshore accounts, his hidden liabilities, any shell companies he might be operating, and most importantly, his underground debts. Find out who he owes money to. He is currently standing in my private study talking about collateral and high-stakes games. He has turned my oceanfront property into a staging ground for a criminal syndicate, and I intend to bury him so deeply he will never see daylight again." Wallace did not gasp or express shock. He had seen the absolute worst of human nature during our years in corporate warfare. He simply exhaled a slow, steady breath, adjusting his tactical mindset to the new target. "Consider it done, Lawrence. I will wake up the forensic accounting team immediately. I will pull in the private investigators we used during the union disputes last decade. They owe us favors and they work fast. We will trace every penny this boy has ever touched. You will have a preliminary dossier before sunrise." I thanked him and ended the call, setting the phone down on the metal console. The wheels of his destruction were officially in motion. My attention returned entirely to the high-definition feed from the master study. Trent had given up on simply rattling the cabinet handles. He was now frantically pacing the perimeter of the room, running his trembling hands through his sweat-slicked hair. He muttered quietly to himself, his voice a frantic stream of curses and desperate rationalizations picked up perfectly by the hidden microphone. I watched as he paused near my desk and grabbed a heavy, solid brass letter opener. It was a gift from Rachel for my 60th birthday, engraved with a message of love. The sheer audacity of using a gift from my daughter to break into my private files sent a fresh wave of cold anger washing over me. He marched back to the filing cabinets, wedging the thick brass blade into the narrow gap between the top drawer and the reinforced steel frame. He gritted his teeth, leaning his entire body weight into the makeshift pry bar, straining against the metal. I was completely manic, driven by a survival instinct that overrode any lingering sense of morality or respect for the family he married into. I watched the muscles in his neck bulge as he pushed harder. With a loud, violent crack that echoed sharply through the audio feed, the locking mechanism finally gave way. The metal drawer slid open with a heavy screeching sound. Trent dropped the ruined letter opener onto the thick carpet and dove into the hanging folders like a starving man tearing into a meal. I leaned closer to the monitor, sliding a dial on the console to magnify the camera feed. I needed a crystal-clear view of his hands and the exact files he was touching. I was pulling out thick manila folders, tossing them haphazardly onto the pristine surface of my mahogany desk, scattering my meticulously organized records. These were not casual tax returns or old utility bills. I was specifically hunting with a terrifying focus, bypassing the general correspondence and diving straight into the heavy binders. I was looking for my estate planning documents, my property deeds, and my insurance policies. He found a thick leather-bound folder labeled Coastal Property and ripped it open with shaking fingers. His eyes widened, reflecting the dim light of the study as he stared at the official deed to my $5 million villa. I watched his chest heave as he let out a ragged breath of pure relief. He pulled his smartphone from his pocket, his hands trembling so violently he almost dropped the device onto the desk. I watched in absolute silence as he opened his camera application and began snapping high-resolution photographs of every single page. He smoothed out the creases of the deed, pressing it flat against the mahogany wood, taking multiple pictures to ensure the text was perfectly legible. He photographed my signature on the trust agreements, zooming in on the curves of my handwriting. He photographed the exact dimensions of the property lines, the tax assessment values, and the structural blueprints of the estate. I was not just stealing information. He was gathering the exact templates he needed to forge my signature. He was documenting the necessary legal jargon to transfer the ownership of my home to the violent men he owed his life to. I was preparing to sign away my legacy, my daughter's future security, to save his own pathetic skin. The betrayal was so absolute, so meticulously calculated, that it transcended mere theft. I was actively plotting to erase my ownership and gaslight my daughter into believing I had willingly handed over my kingdom. I reached over and tapped the archive button, capturing his digital theft from 3 different camera angles, ensuring there were no blind spots in the evidence. He thought he was being so incredibly clever, moving quietly in the dead of night, while his hooligan friends distracted the neighborhood with their loud music. But he was nothing more than a rat trapped in a glass maze, desperately chewing through the walls while the exterminator watched from above. Let him take his pictures, I thought to myself, letting a cold, grim satisfaction settle over me. Let him believe he has found the ultimate loophole. Every photograph he took, every document he compromised, was just another iron bar being welded onto his future prison cell. I sat back in the darkness of the caretaker cottage, listening to the soft clicks of his camera shutter. The trap was set, and Trent was willingly walking right into the center of it. All I had to do now was wait for Wallace to deliver the ammunition that would blow his entire fraudulent life to pieces. The digital clock, glowing on my security console, read 4 in the morning. The once chaotic audio feed from the main house had finally fallen silent, replaced only by the low hum of the ocean wind outside my hidden bunker. On the primary monitor, the grand living room looked like a battlefield of broken glass, spilled liquor, and discarded tracksuits. The men who had invaded my sanctuary were passed out across my custom furniture, snoring heavily in drunken stupors. Trent had not returned to the master suite. I found him on camera 4, slumped over the kitchen island, his head resting on his arms, an empty bottle of whiskey overturned near his elbow. He looked exactly like what he truly was. He was a broken, pathetic boy, hiding from the monsters he had invited into his life. The silence in the caretaker cottage was broken by the sharp buzzing of my encrypted cell phone. It was Wallace. He was exactly on time. I picked up the device and pressed it to my ear, not taking my eyes off Trent's sleeping form on the screen. "Tell me everything," I said, my voice low and steady. "Lawrence, it is worse than we anticipated," Wallace began. His tone was not alarmed, but it possessed the cold, clinical edge of a surgeon diagnosing a terminal disease. The forensic accounting team tore through his financial history for the past 3 years. Trent is not a tech entrepreneur, Lawrence. He is a financial ghost. He is completely, unconditionally bankrupt. I leaned forward in my leather chair. "Explain the startup," I demanded. "It was a shell game," Wallace replied. "He registered a limited liability company 2 years ago and secured a moderate round of seed funding based purely on the fact that he was married into your family. Investors trusted your name, not his business model. But there was no product. There was no proprietary algorithm. Trent took that seed money and incinerated it. He bought the leased luxury vehicles, the designer wardrobes, the expensive dinners. I used the capital to fund an illusion of success, to keep Rachel and her social circle completely fooled. The company quietly collapsed 12 months ago. He has not drawn a legitimate paycheck in over a year." I let out a slow, measured breath. A whole year. For an entire year, he had been waking up, putting on a tailored suit, and kissing my daughter goodbye before driving off to an office that did not exist. He had sat at my dining table during holidays, boasting about profit margins and expansion plans while secretly drowning in absolute failure. How has he been funding this lifestyle for the past 12 months, I asked, gripping the edge of the console. That is where the situation turns toxic, Wallace said, when the legitimate banks cut him off and the credit cards maxed out. He panicked. He needed to maintain the facade at all costs, because admitting failure meant losing Rachel and losing his proximity to your wealth. So he went underground. He started taking high-interest loans from unregulated lenders in the city. Then he started gambling to try and win the money back. He lost everything. I watched Trent shift uncomfortably in his sleep on the monitor. How deep is the hole, Wallace? Give me the exact number. I is underwater for exactly $500,000, Wallace stated plainly. And he does not owe this money to a bank, Lawrence. He owes it to an organized syndicate operating out of the city. These are men who do not send collection letters. They send enforcers. They break legs and they take properties by force. The interest alone is accumulating faster than he could ever hope to pay. They gave him a final deadline to settle the principal debt. When is the deadline? I asked, already knowing the answer deep in my gut. This weekend, Wallace confirmed. They told him that if he did not produce $500,000 by Sunday night, they were going to start going after his family. They explicitly mentioned Rachel. The mention of my daughter being threatened by violent criminals because of this pathetic coward sent a wave of pure, unadulterated fury coursing through my veins. He had brought the absolute worst kind of danger directly to Rachel's doorstep. He had used her as a shield, and now she was standing in the crosshairs of a ruthless syndicate. I thought about Rachel when she was a little girl running down the driveway of our old house in the suburbs, holding a painted wooden boat she had made in school. I remembered how hard I worked, how many cross-country hauls I drove to ensure she would never have to worry about paying for college or buying her first home. I built my empire so my family would be safe from the cruelty of the world. And now this arrogant little boy was trying to sell the fortress I built for her to the very monsters I spent my life protecting her from. He had weaponized my love for her. He used her bright, optimistic nature as a shield for his corruption. It was a violation that demanded absolute, total retribution. I felt my chest tighten, but I forced my breathing to remain calm. Panic is the enemy of strategy. He told them he had collateral, I murmured, remembering the frantic phone call I had intercepted earlier in the study. He told them he had a secured venue for their operation. Wallace rustled papers on his end of the line. His investigators had traced Trent's failed company through public filings, creditor records, available through lawful financial channels and communications recovered from the business accounts his own audit team had authority to review. The pattern was consistent. Trent had represented my villa as available collateral, described me as an aging owner he could control, and promised the syndicate a temporary venue for a high-stakes gambling operation. He had not yet transferred the property, but every move he made inside my study showed he was preparing the documents to try, and the principal debt. I asked, the cold reality solidifying in my mind. How is he planning to pay off the $500,000? He promised to sign the deed of your home over to the syndicate boss, Wallace said, his voice hardening with disgust. He intends to use the forged documents he is preparing to transfer ownership of your property to a front company controlled by the syndicate. He plans to use your home as the ultimate bargaining chip to wipe his slate clean. Once the transfer is complete, he plans to tell Rachel that you signed the papers during a severe bout of dementia and that the state seized the house. I is going to leave you homeless, declare you mentally incompetent, and walk away completely free of his debts. I sat in the dark command center, letting the sheer magnitude of his betrayal wash over me. Trent was not just a greedy son-in-law looking for a handout. He was a malicious, calculating parasite. I was willing to strip me of my dignity, my sanity, and my life savings just to cover up his own pathetic failures. I was willing to watch my daughter cry over my supposed mental decline while secretly handing her inheritance to violent criminals. "Are you still there?" Lawrence Wallace asked, breaking the silence. "I am here," I replied softly. The morning sun broke through the coastal fog, casting a pale light over the Pacific Ocean. I remained seated in the dimly lit command center of the caretaker cottage. My eyes were locked on the security monitors, observing the aftermath of the chaotic night. The living room of my $5 million villa looked like a disaster zone. Empty bottles and discarded food wrappers littered the imported marble floors. Trent stood in the center of the mess, rubbing his temples and cursing under his breath. He began kicking the sleeping bodies of his frat boy friends, barking orders for them to wake up and leave. He knew his real masters were arriving soon, and he needed the stage cleared. The men groaned and stumbled toward their cars, nursing severe hangovers. They packed their cheap bags and drove their rented vehicles out through the main gates, leaving my property in absolute silence. Trent spent the next few hours in a frantic state of panic. He dragged heavy industrial trash bags across the room, hiding the evidence of his reckless party. He pushed my custom leather sofas against the walls, clearing a massive open space in the center of the grand living room. He wiped down the glass coffee tables with shaking hands, sweating profusely despite the cool ocean breeze blowing through the open patio doors. He was no longer playing the role of an arrogant tech founder. I was a terrified animal, preparing his den for the apex predators. I watched him pace the length of the hallway, checking his phone every 30 seconds. He was checking the time, dreading the arrival of the men who held his life in their hands. Late Saturday afternoon, the atmosphere on the surveillance feeds shifted dramatically. The cameras at the front gate picked up a convoy of 4 matte black luxury sport utility vehicles. They did not speed up the driveway or play loud, obnoxious music like Trent's friends had done. They moved in perfect synchronization, sliding onto the property with a terrifying silent efficiency. The vehicles parked in a tactical formation near the fountain, ensuring clear sightlines to all exits. The doors opened simultaneously, and the men who stepped out sent a chill down my spine. They wore impeccably tailored dark suits, but their posture screamed of organized violence. I could see the subtle bulges of firearms printed beneath their expensive jackets. They did not admire the ocean view or the architecture of my home. They immediately scanned the perimeter, checking the rooflines and the dark corners for security threats. They walked to the trunks of their vehicles and pulled out massive reinforced duffel bags, holding them with a practiced ease that suggested heavy contents. Trent practically sprinted out the front doors to greet them. He was bowing his head and wiping his sweaty palms on his trousers. He approached a man who stepped out of the lead vehicle. This man had silver hair slicked back and walked with a quiet, terrifying authority that commanded absolute obedience. Trent offered a trembling hand, but the syndicate boss ignored it entirely. The older man simply looked past Trent, evaluating the reinforced glass windows and the solid structure of my villa. He gave a subtle nod to his enforcers, and the men marched forward, pushing past Trent as if he were nothing more than a ghost. I watched through the high-definition cameras as my peaceful retirement sanctuary was systematically transformed into a major criminal enterprise. The men hauled the heavy duffel bags into the cleared living room and unzipped them. They did not unpack clothes or personal items. They pulled out folded casino-grade felt tables, bringing the underground gambling den directly into my home. They assembled the tables with mechanical precision, locking the metal legs into place right over my expensive Persian rugs. Another group of men carried in heavy cases filled with professional betting chips and sophisticated electronic cash counting machines. They set up a temporary bar in the corner, stocking it with high-end liquor and crystal glasses they had brought themselves. They were entirely self-sufficient, operating a mobile, illicit casino with flawless execution. Trent hovered near the edge of the room, wringing his hands together. He tried to speak to the silver-haired boss, offering him a drink, but the older man dismissed him with a single flick of his wrist. Trent retreated to the shadows of the hallway, pulling at his collar and drinking heavily from a hidden flask. He had promised these men a secure, isolated venue to pay off his massive underground debts. I thought he was brokering a high-level deal. But the reality of his situation was painfully obvious on the monitors. He was not a partner. I was a desperate servant who had opened the door for monsters just to save his own pathetic life. As the sun completely disappeared below the horizon, the exterior property lights automatically illuminated the driveway. More vehicles began to arrive, slipping through the open gates under the cover of darkness. These were not the enforcers. These were the players. Men and women draped in flashy jewelry and designer clothing walked through my front doors carrying metal briefcases. They were escorted past Trent by the armed guards and guided directly to the green felt tables. The quiet hum of the ocean was entirely replaced on my audio feeds by the sound of clinking chips and shuffling cards. Stacks of bundled $100 bills were casually tossed onto the tables. The cash counting machines began to hum continuously in the background, processing massive amounts of illicit currency right inside my living room. I sat in the dark command center feeling a cold, calculated rage harden my resolve. I was watching a major federal crime unfold in real time. The sheer volume of cash moving across those tables meant that Trent had crossed a line from which there was absolutely no return. This was no longer just a family dispute over forged documents and stolen property. This was a highly organized syndicate laundering money and running an illegal gambling ring on my estate. The gambling den roared below my house, but my focus shifted away from the crowded tables and the piles of illicit cash. I turned my attention to a separate monitor on my control console. While the syndicate boss smoked a cigar and watched his dealers work, Trent was hovering nervously near the edge of the kitchen island. He had a sleek silver laptop open in front of him. I zoomed the camera in on his hands. He was typing frantically, his face illuminated by the harsh glow of the screen. When I built this coastal fortress, I did not just wire it for physical security. The digital infrastructure was military-grade. The wireless network broadcasting through the main villa was a segmented guest network completely isolated from my private servers. And because I designed the system, I held the master administrative keys. During my years running a national freight empire, I had to secure data centers against corporate espionage. I knew exactly how to track digital footprints. I reached across my console and booted up a network diagnostic tool. It was a simple piece of software I used to use to track employee data usage back in the day. Within seconds, I bypassed the guest router and gained full access to every packet of data flowing through the airwaves of my property. Trent was connected to my network, and he was preparing to send emails. I watched the data logs light up on my screen, indicating a massive transfer of encrypted files. With a few keystrokes, I intercepted the outgoing traffic, capturing the raw data before it bounced to the external servers. I opened the intercepted files on my secondary monitor, allowing the decryption software to do its work. What I saw made my blood run colder than the Pacific Ocean outside my window. He had attached three high-resolution digital documents to an email addressed to a man with a suspicious domain name. I recognized the recipient from Wass's earlier background report. It was the syndicate's underground lawyer, a man known for facilitating illegal property transfers and laundering assets through untraceable shell corporations. I opened the first attachment, taking a slow, measured breath. It was a durable power of attorney document. The legal phrasing was dense, but the intent was brutally clear. It granted Trent absolute total control over my finances, my medical decisions, and my real estate assets. I scrolled down to the bottom of the page. There, sitting above the dotted line, was my signature. It was an absolute masterpiece of forgery. He had captured the exact slant of my cursive, the heavy pressure on the capital letters, and the slight tail at the end of my last name. He had used the photographs he took in my study the night before to trace my handwriting with terrifying precision. He had even managed to secure a fake notary stamp on the bottom corner. I opened the second attachment. It was a quitclaim deed legally transferring the ownership of my $5 million oceanfront villa to a holding company controlled by the syndicate boss. My forged signature was on that document as well. Trent was actively finalizing the paperwork to hand my home over as collateral. I was selling the roof over my head to pay for his gambling debts, washing his hands of his financial ruin at my expense. But it was the third attachment that revealed the true depth of his depravity. It was not a legal document. It was a draft of a letter addressed to my daughter Rachel. He was using the email server to back up his personal files, preparing the narrative he would use to destroy her world. I read the words he had typed, and I felt a physical sickness twist in my stomach. "My dearest Rachel," the drafted letter began. "I do not know how to tell you this, but your father's mind is completely gone. I came to visit him at the villa this weekend, and found him wandering the halls completely disoriented. He did not know what year it was. He thought I was a stranger. He panicked and started signing away his assets to random investment firms he found online. I tried to stop him, but the doctors say the cognitive decline is aggressive and permanent. The state has already seized the house due to his erratic financial behavior. I am so sorry, darling, but we have to look into putting him in a secure memory care facility for his own safety." I sat in the silence of the caretaker cottage, staring at the glowing text. The sheer malice of his plan was almost impossible to comprehend. He was not just stealing my money or my home. He was going to gaslight my only child. He was going to make Rachel believe that her strong, capable father had lost his mind overnight. He was going to force her to mourn the loss of my intellect while I was still alive and breathing. He was going to lock me in a psychiatric ward against my will, leaving me to rot in a sterile room while he spent her inheritance and lived free of his debts. I saved the intercepted emails and the forged attachments directly to my encrypted hard drive. I compiled the digital evidence into a secure folder and immediately transmitted it to Wallace. The trap was no longer just about illegal gambling or trespassing. Trent had just committed federal wire fraud and felony forgery right across my network. The digital fingerprints he left behind were irrefutable. I watched him on the camera feed. He hit the send button on his laptop, shutting the machine with a heavy sigh of relief. He took a long drink from his glass of whiskey and looked around my kitchen with a smug, satisfied grin. He truly believed he had won. He believed the documents were securely on their way to the syndicate lawyer, and his slate would be wiped clean by morning. He thought he had outsmarted the old man. I looked at his smiling face on the monitor, and I made a silent promise to my daughter. I would not let this parasite touch another hair on her head. I would not let him shed a single crocodile tear over my false decline. I was going to tear his entire world down to the studs, and I was going to do it so publicly that he would never be able to manipulate another human being for the rest of his miserable life. The syndicate enforcers were still drinking my wine and counting their dirty cash in the living room. The game was reaching its peak. The money on the tables was piling higher and higher. Trent walked out of the kitchen and approached the silver-haired boss, carrying a printed copy of the forged deed in a leather folder. This was the moment of no return. I handed the folder to the crime boss. The older man opened it, scanned the forged signatures, and gave Trent a slow, approving nod. Trent's debt was officially settled in their eyes. He had sold his soul and my home to the devil. I leaned back in my chair, letting the cold reality of the situation harden my nerves into steel. He had forged his future, but he had no idea that I held the pen that would write his absolute destruction. The glowing screens of the command center painted the small cottage in harsh blue light. I watched the syndicate enforcers stacking bricks of $100 bills on my custom dining table. The contrast between the life I had built and the criminal filth polluting it made my chest tight. Then the silence of my bunker was broken by a soft melody. My personal phone was vibrating on the metal console. The caller ID displayed a picture of Rachel smiling on her graduation day. Seeing her face right next to the surveillance feed of the illegal casino her husband was running sent a fresh wave of nausea through my stomach. I reached for the phone. I knew I had to control my breathing. I had to sound like a relaxed 75-year-old man enjoying a weekend at a luxury health spa. I cleared my throat, masking the cold fury completely, and answered the call. "Hi, sweetheart. I said, forcing a warmth into my voice that I absolutely did not feel. Dad, Rachel chirped, her voice bright and full of a joy that broke my heart into 1,000 pieces. I am so glad I caught you. Trent told me you went up to Carmel for a spa weekend to help your back. Are you feeling any better? I am doing just fine, I replied smoothly. The thermal pools are doing wonders for the old bones. How are things with you? Oh, Dad, I just had to call and say thank you, she said, her voice thick with genuine emotion. Trent called me a few hours ago. He said the investor retreat is going incredibly well. He told me the venture capitalists absolutely love the villa, and that the isolation is really helping them focus on the funding contracts. I looked up at the monitor. One of the supposed venture capitalists was currently drinking whiskey straight from the bottle while a syndicate dealer shuffled a deck of cards. Is that right? I murmured, gripping the edge of the console. Yes. Rachel continued, entirely oblivious to the nightmare unfolding inside her future inheritance. He said you were so incredibly supportive of his startup. I know Trent has struggled to find his footing over the last year, but he has been working so hard on this new software. This funding round is going to change everything for him, for us. He said you even gave him the master bedroom so he could prepare his pitches in peace. You have no idea how much this means to him, Dad. And it means the world to me. Every single word she spoke was a dagger coated in poison. Trent had not just lied to her about the state of his failing business. He had weaponized her innocence. I was actively using her love for me to cover his tracks, making her believe that this criminal staging ground was a family-supported triumph. I could hear the pride in her voice, the desperate hope that her husband was finally becoming the man she believed him to be. She was completely blind to the fact that the man she slept next to every night was preparing to sign away her entire future to violent men. I am just glad I could provide the space, I managed to say, swallowing the thick knot of grief rising in my throat. You know I only want the best for you, Rachel. I know, Dad, she sighed softly. Trent is so stressed out, but he told me he finally feels like a real provider. He said this weekend is going to wipe away all the hard times. I was right about one thing. This weekend was going to wipe away everything, but not in the way he promised her. As I listened to my daughter praise a monster, a terrifying realization settled over me. I could not just call the local police and have them clear the house. I could not just walk up there and kick Trent out. If I simply halted the gambling and threw him off the property, he would run straight back to Rachel, playing the ultimate victim. He would twist the narrative with the skill of a seasoned sociopath. He would tell her that I was a jealous, controlling old man who ruined his one chance at success because I did not want to see him thrive. He would claim the men were legitimate investors and that I had embarrassed him so deeply that they pulled their funding. And Rachel, blinded by her loyalty and her vows, would believe him. She would look at me with resentment. She would think her father was a tyrant who destroyed her husband's dreams. I could not just cut the weed at the stem. I had to rip it out by the roots and expose the toxic soil for everyone to see. I had to let Trent complete his fraudulent transaction. I had to let Trent complete his fraudulent transaction. I had to let him hand over the forged deed. I needed the federal authorities to catch him holding the smoking gun, so there would be absolutely no room for alternative facts or tearful excuses. Rachel needed to see the handcuffs. She needed to hear the audio recordings of him trading our family legacy to criminals. It was the only way to shatter his illusion permanently and protect her from spending the rest of her life tethered to a parasite. Well, let us hope Trent gets exactly what he has earned this weekend, I said, injecting a double meaning into the phrase that only I could understand. You just relax at home, sweetheart. I will see you when I get back from the spa. I love you, Dad, Rachel said softly. Thank you again. You are the best father a girl could ask for. I love you too, Rachel, I replied. I ended the call and set the phone down on the metal desk. The silence in the room felt heavier now, thick with the weight of the task ahead. My hands were shaking, not from fear, but from the immense emotional restraint it took to not drive a truck straight through the living room windows. I looked back at the surveillance monitors. Trent was now standing near the kitchen island laughing with the syndicate boss. He thought he had completely outsmarted me. I thought his lies were an impenetrable fortress, protecting him from the consequences of his miserable choices. But he had fundamentally misunderstood the man he was trying to rob. He saw an old man ready to be put out to pasture. He did not see the father who would burn the entire world to the ground to keep his daughter safe. I opened my eyes and locked them back onto the glowing screens. The gambling tables were bustling with activity. Smoke drifted up toward the high ceilings from thick cigars. The women draped in expensive jewelry were drinking champagne from my crystal glasses. The men were tossing plastic chips that represented thousands of dollars across the green felt, and Trent was playing the gracious host, hovering near the edges of the room, desperate to be accepted by the very criminals who were currently holding his life in their hands. He was nothing but a pawn in their game, and yet he walked around my home as if he had conquered an empire. The sheer audacity of his drafted email to Rachel echoed in my mind. He was going to tell her I had lost my cognitive functions. He was going to have me locked away in a memory care facility. He was going to force my daughter to watch me supposedly deteriorate while he siphoned the remaining funds from my accounts. The emotional cruelty of that plan was almost difficult to process. He was willing to inflict the deepest psychological trauma on his own wife just to cover up his gambling debts. He did not love Rachel. He did not even view her as a human being. She was simply a mechanism, a bridge to access my wealth. I wiped the last trace of sorrow from my mind and turned my full attention back to the glowing control console. The emotional part of the night was over. From that point forward, every move had to be documented, timed, and impossible for Trent to explain away later. I reached for my encrypted phone and called Wallace again. I told him Rachel had just thanked me for supporting the fake investor retreat. I told him Trent had transmitted forged property papers, drafted a lie about my supposed cognitive decline, and was preparing to use my villa as collateral for the syndicate. Wallace listened without interrupting. When I finished, his voice turned cold and precise. Federal investigators had already been briefed through the evidence package his office delivered, he said. Gaming enforcement officials had reviewed the live footage of the illegal tables, the cash and the armed men moving through my house. The investigators, not Wallace, had secured the judicial authority required for the operation. Tactical teams were staged several miles down the coastal highway, close enough to move quickly, but far enough away that the convoy would not alert the syndicate. I told Wallace the outer perimeter could be controlled remotely. The driveway gate and the private beach gate would close first, preventing vehicles or people from slipping off the property once the final transaction began. But I would leave the villa doors and storm shutters in normal operating mode until Trent physically handed over the forged deed. I wanted everyone inside to believe they still controlled the night. If I sealed the house too soon, the syndicate might scatter across the grounds or destroy evidence before the transaction was complete. Wallace agreed. No premature confrontation, no theatrical warning. We would let Trent walk voluntarily through the last open door in his own plan. Once the deed changed hands, I would trigger the full emergency lockdown. Wallace would notify the tactical commander that the evidence threshold we had been waiting for was complete, and the authorities would begin their approach. I ended the call and set the phone beside the console. The countdown had officially begun. I turned my chair toward the master environmental control panel. The smart home system governing my villa was a sophisticated network of automated defenses designed to withstand severe coastal hurricanes and potential home invasions. I typed my master administrative credentials into the keyboard, overriding the basic settings Trent thought he controlled. My fingers flew across the keys, executing commands with the precision of a man who spent his life managing global freight logistics. First, I accessed the main perimeter controls. I pulled up the schematics for the massive wrought iron gates at the top of the driveway. Trent had left them standing wide open to allow the syndicate members to come and go freely. With a single keystroke, I initiated the silent closure protocol. On the exterior monitors, I watched the heavy iron doors slowly swing shut, sealing the only vehicular exit off the property. The magnetic locks engaged with a heavy click, dropping thick steel deadbolts deep into the concrete foundation. I went into the digital registry and deleted Trent's temporary access codes. Even if he ran to the keypad, he would find himself completely locked out of the system. The front gate was now a solid wall of iron and stone. Next, I targeted the beach access. The back of the villa featured a beautiful wooden staircase that wound down the steep cliffside to a private cove. It was the perfect escape route for desperate criminals looking to slip away in the dark. I navigated to the security tab and triggered the secondary barrier. A thick, reinforced steel gate positioned at the top of the stairs slid perfectly into place. The electronic lock flashed red on my screen, indicating it was fully secured. The ocean route was officially closed. I shifted my focus to the physical structure of the villa itself. The floor-to-ceiling glass windows in the grand living room provided a spectacular view of the Pacific, but they were also a vulnerability. I had installed automated storm shutters hidden seamlessly within the architectural framing. These shutters were constructed from overlapping plates of high-grade titanium, designed to stop flying debris during a Category 5 hurricane. I queued up the command sequence, but I kept my finger hovering over the activation key. If I dropped the shutters too early, the loud mechanical grinding would alert the syndicate that they were trapped. I needed to wait for the exact moment the raid commenced to seal the windows. I moved to the internal locking controls, but I did not engage them. Every exterior door in the villa was equipped with heavy electromagnetic seals, and the storm shutters above the glass walls could turn the house into a sealed shell within seconds. I armed the emergency sequence and removed Trent's temporary administrator privileges, leaving the ordinary door functions untouched. On my screen, the lockdown icon changed from gray to amber, ready waiting, but not active. That was exactly how I wanted it. The syndicate men could still walk through the villa, drink my whiskey, and believe they controlled the property. Only the outer gates had closed. They had not noticed, because no one was trying to leave yet. The real cage would not snap shut until Trent finished the forged transfer. I rested my hand beside the master switch and watched the monitors. One command would seal the doors and drop the shutters. Until then, patience was part of the trap. The gambling tables were still buzzing with chaotic energy. Stacks of dirty $100 bills were being pushed across the green felt. The cash counting machines hummed a steady rhythm, drowning out the quiet clicks of the electronic locks engaging all around them. The wealthy patrons who had arrived in their flashy cars were completely absorbed in their illicit games, throwing away thousands of dollars on every hand. They thought they were untouchable, insulated by their money and their arrogance. They had no idea that federal tactical vehicles were currently rolling down the dark coastal highway, heading straight for their location. I focused my attention on Trent. He was pacing near the base of the glass staircase, clutching that leather folder tightly against his chest. He was sweating profusely, wiping his forehead with a trembling hand. He kept looking toward the silver-haired syndicate boss, waiting for the perfect pause in the action to hand over the forged deed. He was so incredibly eager to sign away my life. He looked at his watch, then looked out the large glass windows into the dark night. I was probably thinking about Rachel, hoping she was asleep, hoping his lies would hold together until morning. He thought he was minutes away from total salvation. I felt a deep, cold calm settle over my mind. The anger that had been burning inside me since his first arrogant phone call was entirely gone, replaced by a profound sense of purpose. I was not acting out of revenge. I was performing a necessary surgical extraction to save my daughter's future. I had built the walls around them, and now I was locking the doors. I watched the digital timer on my console count down the seconds. The federal agents were approaching the perimeter. The steel cage was fully secured. All the escape routes were blocked. I took a slow, deep breath of the cool air inside the caretaker cottage keeping my hand resting near the master override switch. Trent was standing in the center of my home holding the very documents that would send him to federal prison. The trap was perfectly laid, and it was finally time to watch it snap shut. The digital clocks on my surveillance monitors rolled over to 1 in the morning. Inside my $5 million oceanfront villa, the illegal underground casino had reached a fever pitch. I sat in the silent caretaker cottage watching the high-definition feeds with the clinical detachment of a man observing an experiment. The grand living room was unrecognizable. The custom Italian leather sofas had been shoved against the walls to make room for 5 professional-grade felt tables. Thick clouds of cigar smoke drifted toward the vaulted ceilings, obscuring the modern chandeliers. The wealthy patrons who had arrived in their matte black luxury vehicles were entirely absorbed in their illicit games. These were not amateur gamblers playing for pennies. Through the zoomed-in camera angles, I watched stacks of banded $100 bills moving back and forth across the green felt. The cash-counting machines hummed a constant, relentless rhythm that I could hear perfectly through the hidden microphones. There were easily several $1 million in liquid, untraceable cash sitting on my dining room tables. The sheer audacity of the operation was staggering, but it was also exactly what I needed. Every single bill placed on those tables elevated the federal charges against the men in that room. At the head of the main table sat the silver-haired syndicate boss. He was not playing. He was simply observing the flow of money with a cold, calculating gaze. 2 massive enforcers stood directly behind his chair, their eyes constantly scanning the room for threats. They were completely oblivious to the fact that the real threat was not inside the room, but sitting in a bunker a few hundred yards away, monitoring their every breath. I watched Trent take a long, shallow breath, steeling his nerves. He stepped away from the bar and began to navigate through the crowded room. He dodged the cocktail waitresses and the cheering gamblers, keeping his eyes firmly fixed on the silver-haired boss. This was the moment. I was walking toward the precipice, and he was bringing my forged signature with him. I slid the audio controls on my console to maximize the feed from the microphone hidden in the ceiling fixture directly above the boss. Trent stopped at the edge of the main table, waiting for the older man to acknowledge him. The boss did not look up immediately. He let Trent stand there, forcing him to stew in his own anxiety. It was a classic power move, a silent reminder of who truly controlled the room. After a full minute, the boss finally raised his hand, signaling the enforcers to step back slightly. He turned his cold, dead eyes toward my son-in-law. "Do you have the paperwork?" Trent, the boss, asked, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that barely carried over the noise of the casino. Trent nodded vigorously, his head bobbing up and down like a desperate puppet. "Yes, sir. Everything is fully executed just like we agreed. The collateral is completely secured." He placed the leather folder on the green felt table, sliding it carefully toward the older man. I leaned closer to the monitor, my heart beating a slow, steady rhythm against my ribs. I knew exactly what was inside that folder, because I had intercepted the digital drafts hours ago. It contained the fraudulent power of attorney and the forged quitclaim deed transferring the ownership of my estate to the syndicate holding company. The boss opened the folder. He pulled a pair of reading glasses from his tailored jacket and placed them on his nose. He took his time reading the legal jargon, flipping through the thick stack of papers. Trent stood frozen, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. I could see the muscle in his jaw jumping. He was terrified that the boss would spot the forgery, that he would realize the old man had not actually signed away his life. But Trent had done his criminal homework well. The signatures were perfect replicas of my own. The boss reached the final page. He looked at the signature, then looked up at Trent. "You are absolutely sure the old man is not going to be a problem?" he asked. "I do not want any messy legal battles with a senile homeowner." Trent swallowed hard, forcing a confident smile onto his sweaty face. "Lawrence is completely gone, sir. His mind is mush. I am finalizing the paperwork to have him committed to a secure psychiatric facility on Monday morning. By the time anyone even realizes the property has been transferred, he will be locked in a severe dementia ward." My wife has total blind faith in me. She will not ask a single question. The house is yours free and clear. Hearing him articulate the plan out loud, speaking the words into existence, filled me with a cold, unyielding rage. He was casually discussing the absolute destruction of my life and my daughter's heart, as if he were negotiating the sale of a used car. He was selling my sanity to pay for his sins. I reached forward and pressed the digital marker on the recording software, stamping that exact audio clip for the federal prosecutors. The boss gave a slow, approving nod. He pulled a heavy gold pen from his inner pocket. He signed the bottom of the transfer acknowledgement form, officially accepting the stolen property as payment for the $500,000 underground debt. He slid the document back across the table toward Trent. "Sign the final ledger," he ordered. "Once your name is on that line, your debt is cleared. But if this blows back on us, Trent, you know exactly what will happen to you and your pretty wife." Trent did not hesitate. He did not pause to consider the monumental betrayal he was committing. He took the gold pen and scribbled his name onto the syndicate ledger. He was officially finalizing the wire fraud, the forgery, and the illegal property transfer, all in one swift motion. He handed the pen back, standing up a little straighter. "We are good," the boss said, closing the leather folder and handing it to one of his enforcers. "Go get a drink, Trent. Enjoy the hospitality of your former home." He ordered a glass of expensive bourbon, laughing loudly with the bartender. He took a sip and looked around my grand living room, a smug, victorious grin spreading across his face. He thought he was a mastermind. He thought he had outplayed the syndicate, outsmarted the old man, and secured his future using my money. He looked out the massive floor-to-ceiling glass windows, staring into the dark ocean night, completely oblivious to the fact that those windows were about to become his prison walls. I glanced at the secondary monitor, displaying the tactical secure channel linked to Wallace. The message on the screen was short and absolute. "The federal strike teams are in position at the perimeter. We are holding for your command, Lawrence." I watched the silver-haired boss hand the forged folder to his enforcer. The transaction was complete. Trent turned back to the bar with a victorious smile, completely unaware that his life as a free man had just expired. I sat in the light of the caretaker cottage, my hand resting firmly on the master control console. The digital timer on my screen showed the federal agents were exactly 2 minutes away from the perimeter. It was time to pull the trigger. I moved my finger over the heavy red switch on the command board. This was the emergency lockdown sequence I designed specifically for severe coastal storms and catastrophic security breaches. I pressed the switch downward and heard the satisfying mechanical click echo in the quiet room. Instantly, the security monitors flashed a brilliant warning yellow. I watched the exterior camera as the primary defense systems of the $5 million villa roared to life. At the top of the glass walls lining the grand living room, thick panels of solid titanium began to slide downward. These were the blast shutters designed to withstand hurricane-force winds and flying debris. They descended with a smooth, relentless, heavy motion, slicing through the ocean view and replacing the starry night sky with a solid wall of impenetrable gray metal. Inside the living room, the chaotic noise of the illegal casino masked the initial mechanical hum of the descending shutters. The wealthy patrons were too busy throwing $100 bills onto the green felt tables to notice the outside world disappearing. But the syndicate enforcers standing near the edges of the room were trained to observe their surroundings. One of the large men near the patio doors snapped his head upward, pointing at the descending metal shields. He shouted something to his partner, but his voice was drowned out by the loud bass-heavy music pounding from the commercial speakers. Then the interior doors engaged. Every single exit leading out of the grand living room, including the heavy oak front doors, the side access panels, and the hallway partitions, locked simultaneously. The electromagnetic seals activated with a loud, resounding thud that vibrated through the floorboards. It was a sound so heavy and final that it cut right through the noise of the party. The gamblers finally stopped placing their bets. The dealers froze with cards in their hands. Heads turned toward the massive windows, just as the titanium shutters hit the floor with a deafening metallic crash, sealing the room entirely. Trent froze near the mahogany bar, his glass of expensive bourbon suspended halfway to his mouth. The smug, arrogant smile melted off his face, instantly replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated confusion. He looked at the solid metal walls now covering the windows. He blinked rapidly, trying to process the impossible structural transformation of the house he thought he controlled. I watched his chest heave as his breathing turned shallow and panicked. He set his glass down on the counter and marched toward the nearest control panel mounted on the wall. He jabbed his finger repeatedly against the digital touchscreen, trying to override the system. He muttered frantic commands, swiping the screen with increasing desperation. But the panel was completely dead. I had severed the local network access from the main server. Trent was pressing his fingers against a useless piece of glass. "What is going on here, Trent?" the syndicate boss demanded. His deep, gravelly voice sliced through the rising murmur of the trapped gamblers. The older man did not stand up from his chair at the head table, but his posture had shifted from relaxed confidence to coiled aggression. He glared at Trent with eyes that promised severe consequences. Trent spun around, his face completely devoid of color. "It is just a system glitch," he stammered, taking a tentative step toward the boss. "It is a smart home. Sometimes the severe weather protocols trigger automatically if the sensors detect high winds off the ocean. I will go reset the main breaker in the hallway right now. Just give me 1 second." Trent jogged over to the heavy oak front doors leading to the main hallway. He grabbed the polished brass handles and pulled. The doors did not move a single millimeter. The electromagnetic locks holding them shut possessed thousands of pounds of holding force. Trent pulled harder, bracing his foot against the doorframe and throwing his entire body weight backward. His designer shoes slipped on the marble floor, and he stumbled, gasping for air. The doors remained perfectly solid, a seamless wall of wood and steel blocking his only escape route. The syndicate boss finally stood up from his chair. He motioned to the 2 massive enforcers standing behind him. "Check the exits," he ordered, his voice tight with suppressed fury. The men moved with terrifying speed. One rushed to the patio doors, confirming the titanium shutters were locked tight into the reinforced tracks. The other went to the side entrance leading to the kitchen, tearing at the handle before slamming his heavy shoulder against the wood. The door did not even rattle. He stepped back and pulled a heavy black firearm from the holster hidden beneath his tailored jacket. He aimed the weapon at the electronic keypad mounted next to the door and fired 2 rapid shots. The loud cracks of the gunfire echoed violently through the sealed room, causing several gamblers to scream and drop to the marble floor. The syndicate boss turned his cold, dead eyes slowly toward Trent. My son-in-law was backed against the unyielding front doors, trembling so violently his knees looked ready to give out. He raised his hands defensively, shaking his head in pathetic denial. "I swear I did not do this," Trent cried out, his voice cracking into a high-pitched whine. "I do not know how this happened. The old man must have set a timer on the system before he left. It is just a safety feature. I swear to you, I am not trying to trap you." The boss walked slowly across the room, stepping over the discarded chips and the spilled drinks. His enforcers followed closely behind him, their weapons drawn and ready. The wealthy patrons scrambled out of his way, pressing themselves against the titanium shutters, trying to distance themselves from the impending violence. "You promised me a secure, isolated venue," Trent the boss said, stopping just a few feet away from my terrified son-in-law. "You told me you had complete control of this property. You told me the old man was a senile fool who handed you the keys." "He is a fool," Trent pleaded, tears welling up in his desperate eyes. "He is at a health spa. He has no idea we are even here. This is a machine error. You have to believe me. Please just let me figure out how to pry the panel open." I sat back in my leather chair inside the caretaker cottage, watching the spectacular collapse of the man who tried to steal my life. Trent was weeping, begging for his life from the very monsters he had invited into my home. He had wanted to play the high-rolling corporate genius, But now he was nothing more than a frightened child trapped in a cage of his own making. The illusion of his power was completely shattered. He had absolutely nowhere left to hide and no more lies to spin. The steel box was sealed tight, and the true master of the house was finally ready to make his presence known. The chaos inside the grand living room was reaching a boiling point. I sat in the complete darkness of the caretaker cottage, watching the monitors as Trent desperately pounded his fists against the immovable oak front doors. The wealthy gamblers were pacing like caged animals, their expensive suits and silk dresses looking entirely out of place against the backdrop of an impenetrable titanium vault. The silver-haired syndicate boss took another step toward Trent, his two massive enforcers drawing their weapons and scanning the ceiling for security cameras. The boss demanded answers, his deep voice cutting through the panic, but Trent could only offer pathetic, whimpering lies. He swore the system was malfunctioning. He swore he had total control. He was clinging to the very last shreds of his fabricated reality, completely blind to the executioner sitting just a few hundred yards away. I reached across the metal control console and pulled the heavy microphone of the villa intercom system toward me. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. I felt the cold, absolute certainty of a father eliminating a terminal threat to his daughter. I flipped the activation switch. A sharp electronic chime echoed through the commercial-grade speakers hidden in the vaulted ceilings of the living room, instantly silencing the frantic whispers of the trapped crowd. Every head in the room snapped upward. Trent froze, his hands still pressed against the unyielding wood of the front doors. "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen," I said, my voice booming through the house with a calm, heavy authority that demanded absolute silence. "I apologize for the sudden interruption to your evening, but it appears my son-in-law has been severely misrepresenting the hospitality of my home." Lawrence Trent whispered, his voice cracking into a high-pitched squeak. "Lawrence, please." I did not acknowledge his pathetic plea. I shifted my attention to the silver-haired boss who was staring intensely at one of the security cameras mounted near the chandelier. "To the gentleman currently operating a highly illegal casino on my custom dining tables," I continued, keeping my tone perfectly measured. "I want to make this very clear. You have been brought here under entirely false pretenses. The man trembling by the front doors does not own this property. He does not have a power of attorney. He has no authority to offer my home as collateral for his debts. He is a completely bankrupt fraud who has not drawn a legitimate paycheck in over a year. He brought you here to save his own miserable life using my $5 million sanctuary as a shield. You promised me a secured venue." Trent the boss said, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper. "You told me the old man was a senile fool." "He is senile," Trent suddenly shrieked, the sheer panic pushing him into a state of temporary delusion. "He does not know what he is saying. The system is just glitching. I have the paperwork. I gave you the deed. It is legally yours." The audacity of his continued denial was almost impressive, but I had prepared the ultimate remedy for his delusions. I reached out and tapped the multimedia interface on my console. The massive 85-inch entertainment screens mounted across the living room walls flared to life, illuminating the dark room with a bright, blinding white light. "Let us review the legitimacy of your paperwork, Trent," I said, my voice echoing heavily over the speakers. I triggered the audio file I had intercepted earlier. The room filled with the sound of Trent's own voice whining and begging on the phone from my private study. The recording captured every pathetic detail of his desperate conversation with the underground lender. The trapped crowd listened in absolute silence as Trent begged for 2 more days, promised to use my home as a criminal staging ground, and pleaded to keep his wife out of the crossfire of his massive debts. The audio laid bare his cowardice, exposing the arrogant tech founder as nothing more than a frightened child begging for his life. But I was not finished. The audio was only the beginning of his psychological destruction. I switched the video feed on the massive entertainment screens. The bright white light dissolved into the high-resolution security footage I had captured of Trent in my study. The entire room watched as Trent used a brass letter opener to violently pry open my locked filing cabinets. They watched him tear through my private documents with the frantic energy of a desperate thief. I zoomed the video in, focusing entirely on his hands as he laid out the official property deed on the mahogany desk. The high-definition screens displayed him pulling out his smartphone, taking meticulous photographs of my signature and my personal trust agreements. The visual evidence was absolute. It was an undeniable masterclass in felony forgery broadcast directly to the very people he had just tried to swindle. "The documents he handed you tonight are worthless forgeries," I announced, addressing the syndicate boss once again. He traced my signature to steal my property and wipe out his $500,000 debt. He planned to lock me in a psychiatric ward on Monday morning and gaslight my daughter into believing I had lost my mind. He is not a business partner. He is a parasite. And he has just trapped all of you inside a titanium vault with a mountain of illicit cash and 0 avenues of escape. "You thought you could walk into my home and steal my legacy," I said, my voice dropping an octave, carrying the full weight of 40 years of hard-earned authority. "You thought you could use my daughter as a shield and treat me like an obsolete relic. But you forgot one very important detail, Trent. You forgot that I built this fortress. I know every wire, every camera, and every lock. You tried to play a high-stakes game with a man who holds all the cards." I sat back in my leather chair, watching the absolute despair wash over his face on the security monitors. He looked up at the ceiling, his eyes red and swollen. He was a broken shell of a man. The psychological warfare was complete. He had no pride left, no dignity, and absolutely no defense. The syndicate boss walked slowly toward Trent, his heavy footsteps echoing in the sealed room. He stood over my son-in-law, looking down at him with a mixture of pity and murderous intent. Trent did not even try to defend himself or run away. He just stayed on his knees, waiting for the inevitable consequences of his catastrophic greed. I reached for the intercom switch one final time. I had broken his mind, but the final act of this operation belonged to the authorities. "Do not attempt to harm him," I told the syndicate boss, my voice echoing softly through the quiet room. "He is no longer your problem. He belongs to the federal government now, and they are waiting right outside my gates." I flipped the switch, silencing the intercom and cutting the feed to the entertainment screens. The room plunged back into the dim glow of the chandeliers. The silence inside the villa was absolute, heavy with the dread of men who knew their time was officially up. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the console, and waited for the red and blue lights to flood the oceanfront driveway. Then, the first sign of the inevitable arrived. On my exterior perimeter, monitors, the thick coastal fog blanketing the Pacific Coast Highway began to glow. It started as a faint rhythmic pulsing in the distance. Within seconds, the heavy mist was pierced by an overwhelming flood of flashing red and blue lights. It was not a quiet or subtle approach. Wallace had coordinated a massive federal response, and they were arriving with the full, intimidating weight of the United States government. A convoy of more than 20 vehicles roared down the secluded coastal road. There were marked local police cruisers, unmarked federal black sport utility vehicles, and heavy armored tactical vans. The sheer scale of the operation was breathtaking. They had come to dismantle a major underground syndicate, and they brought an absolute army to do it. I watched the lead tactical vehicle stop just inches from my wrought iron gates. The heavily armed agents began pouring out of the vans, taking strategic positions behind the stone pillars and aiming their weapons toward the dark, silent villa. I reached across my control console and typed in the administrative clearance code for the main driveway. With a heavy mechanical groan, the massive iron gates swung open, granting the federal authorities full access to my property. The convoy surged forward immediately. The vehicles flooded the circular driveway, their high-beam headlights cutting through the darkness and illuminating the stark white walls of my home. The flashing emergency lights painted the exterior of the house in frantic alternating colors of red and blue, casting long dancing shadows across the manicured lawns. I observed the tactical teams fanning out across the estate. They moved with terrifying, coordinated efficiency, One squad sprinted toward the backyard, securing the perimeter around the infinity pool and the locked beach access stairs. Another heavily armed team secured the garage and the side entrances. They were establishing an absolute containment net, ensuring that not a single criminal could slip through the cracks and escape into the ocean night. The main command vehicle parked directly in front of the front entrance, and I saw my attorney Wallace step out of the passenger side. Even at 2 a.m, he was wearing a pristine tailored suit, holding a sleek leather briefcase containing every piece of financial and digital evidence I had transmitted to him. He stood calmly amidst the shouting armed agents, looking like a corporate shark, swimming comfortably in a sea of tactical combat gear. It was time for me to leave the bunker. I powered down the secondary surveillance monitors, leaving only the central recording servers active to capture the final moments of the raid. I stood up from my chair and smoothed the wrinkles from my trousers. I buttoned my jacket, adjusting my collar in the dim light of the screens. I was 75 years old, and I had spent the entire night waging a psychological and technological war against a violent criminal enterprise. My bones ached, and my eyes were heavy with fatigue, but my spirit was completely galvanized. I had protected my daughter. I had secured my legacy. I turned around and walked out of the soundproof command center, opening the heavy steel door and stepping out into the cool ocean night. The air outside was crisp and heavily salted by the Pacific breeze. The chaotic noise of the raid was instantly apparent. I could hear the loud crackle of police radios, the barking of tactical canine units, and the sharp commands of the federal agents echoing across the stone courtyard. I began my ascent up the hidden dirt path that connected the lower hillside to the main driveway. The gravel crunched softly beneath my shoes. I did not rush. I walked with the slow, deliberate pace of a man who had already won the war. The darkness of the cypress trees shielded me as I climbed higher, the flashing emergency lights casting shifting silhouettes across the thick green foliage. I stepped out from the deep shadows of the tree line and walked calmly onto the illuminated driveway. The sudden appearance of an older man in a casual jacket approaching the active staging area immediately caught the attention of the perimeter guards. Several agents turned toward me, raising their high-powered flashlights and aiming the blinding white beams directly at my face. "Halt right there," one of the agents shouted, his hand resting firmly on his holstered weapon. "Identify yourself immediately." I did not stop walking. I simply raised my hand to shield my eyes from the harsh glare of the flashlights. "I am Lawrence," I said, my voice projecting clearly over the noise of the idling engines and the constant static of the police radios. "I am the owner of this property. You are standing in my driveway." Wallace turned his head at the sound of my voice. He immediately raised his hand, gesturing for the agents to lower their lights. "Stand down," he ordered the tactical team, his voice sharp and commanding. "This is my client. He is the homeowner and the primary informant for this federal operation." The tactical commander stepped forward, his expression tight with adrenaline and urgency. "Sir, we need to breach the residence immediately," he said. "We know the syndicate members are heavily armed and trapped inside, but these exterior doors are completely locked down. We are prepared to use explosive charges to blow the hinges off the frame, but it will cause significant structural damage to your home. We need your direct authorization to proceed with the destruction of the entryway." I looked up at the heavy custom oak doors. I knew that Trent was on the exact opposite side of that wood, crying on the marble floor, waiting for his entire world to end. I knew the silver-haired syndicate boss was standing in the dark, surrounded by millions of dollars in illicit cash that would soon be seized by the federal government. They had spent the entire night violating my sanctuary, disrespecting my home, and plotting the ultimate destruction of my family. "There will be no need for explosive charges, Commander," I said, my voice perfectly calm and steady. "I will not have my custom doors ruined because a frightened, arrogant boy decided to invite criminals into my living room. They are already cornered inside a titanium box. They have no weapons that can pierce those storm shutters, and they have absolutely nowhere to run. I control the locks." I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out my encrypted mobile device. I opened the master security application and navigated to the front entrance override controls. The federal agents stacked around the porch raised their weapons, aiming directly at the center of the wooden doors, preparing for the immediate violent confrontation. I looked at Wallace one last time. He nodded, signaling that the legal framework was entirely in place to protect me from any fallout. The trap was ready to be sprung. I pressed my thumb against the digital unlock command on my screen. A loud, heavy mechanical clunk echoed across the courtyard as the thousands of pounds of electromagnetic force instantly released their grip. The locking mechanisms disengaged perfectly, allowing the handles to swing free. The front doors of my $5 million villa were finally unsealed. I took a step back, crossing my arms behind my back, and looked directly at the tactical commander. "The doors are open," I told him quietly. "You may go inside and collect my trash." The heavy oak doors swung inward with a smooth glide that betrayed the violent energy waiting just outside. The tactical teams poured into my home like a tidal wave of black armor and blinding white lights. I walked in slowly behind them, flanked by Wallace and the tactical commander. The grand living room, which had been a hub of arrogant criminal energy just moments before, was now a portrait of absolute submission. The deafening music had been completely severed. The only sounds remaining were the harsh barks of federal agents issuing commands and the heavy thuds of bodies hitting the polished marble floor. The air inside the room was thick with the smell of stale cigar smoke, spilled whiskey, and the sharp, metallic tang of pure fear. The wealthy patrons who had arrived thinking they were untouchable were now face down with their hands locked behind their heads. The syndicate enforcers had surrendered their weapons instantly, realizing that resisting a federal tactical unit inside a sealed titanium vault was a guaranteed death sentence. The silver-haired crime boss stood by the mahogany bar, his hands restrained behind his back in heavy steel cuffs. He looked at me as I walked past him. I did not offer him a single glance. He was a parasite, but he was a professional parasite. He knew the game was over. My focus was entirely on the amateur who had brought him into my home. I found my son-in-law kneeling near the base of the floating glass staircase. Two federal agents were pulling him up roughly by his arms, clicking a pair of heavy metal handcuffs around his wrists. Trent was trembling so violently that his knees kept buckling beneath his weight. His designer clothes were soaked with sweat, and his face was completely drained of color. He looked like a cornered rat trapped in a maze with nowhere left to run. When his frantic eyes finally locked onto me, a spark of desperate recognition flashed across his face. "Lawrence," he sobbed, the tears streaming down his face in thick, rapid drops. "Thank God you are here. You have to tell them. You have to tell them I had no choice. They made me do it, Lawrence. They cornered me in the city and threatened to kill Rachel if I did not let them use the house. They put a gun to my head and forced me to sign those papers. I was just trying to protect my family. I was just trying to keep Rachel safe. I swear to you, I was trying to figure out a way to warn you, but they took my phone. They watched my every move. You know I love Rachel. You know I would never do anything to hurt you." I stood perfectly still, letting his pathetic performance echo across the grand living room. The tactical commander looked at me, waiting to see if the homeowner would corroborate the suspect's story. Wallace stood by my side, his face carved out of stone, entirely unmoved by the theatrical display. I looked down at Trent. He was looking up at me with wide, pleading eyes, relying on the decades of grace I had shown him. He was trying to use my daughter's name as a shield one final time. I thought if he cried hard enough, if he invoked Rachel's safety, the loving father would rush to his defense and beg the authorities for mercy. I did not raise my voice. I did not express an ounce of the fury burning inside my chest. I simply reached into the inner pocket of my jacket and pulled out a sleek digital tablet. I bypassed Trent completely and turned my body to face the lead federal agent standing next to the tactical commander. "Agent," I said, keeping my voice steady, "Trent is claiming that the syndicate forced him into this. I have the original recordings, the unedited surveillance footage, and the transmitted documents. They show what happened before anyone entered this room." I tapped the screen of the tablet, and raised the volume to its maximum capacity. I did not play a video first. I played the crystal-clear audio file of the phone call Trent had made from my private study. His own voice filled the grand living room, crisp and undeniable. The agents listened as the recording played. They heard Trent begging the syndicate for 2 more days. They heard him explicitly offer my home as a secure venue for their illegal operations. They heard him promise the syndicate boss that I was a senile old man who had absolutely no idea what was happening. Trent stopped crying instantly. The fake tears dried up on his cheeks as he listened to his own betrayal broadcast directly to the federal authorities. His mouth fell open, but no sound came out. The illusion of the hostage situation had just evaporated into thin air. I swiped the screen again, bringing up the high-definition 4K video footage from the hidden camera in my study. I turned the tablet around so the lead agent, the tactical commander, and Trent could all see the bright screen perfectly. The video showed Trent completely alone in my office. There were no armed guards forcing him to do anything. There were no syndicate members holding him hostage. The pristine footage showed him using a brass letter opener to violently break into my locked filing cabinets. It showed him pulling out the property deeds and meticulously photographing them with his personal smartphone. It showed him sitting at my desk, smiling, as he forged my signature onto the power of attorney documents, entirely of his own free will. And finally I said, swiping to the last document on the screen. This is an intercepted email transmitted from his personal device across my secure network exactly 1 hour ago. It contains the forged quitclaim deed, transferring my $5 million estate to a holding company operated by organized crime. It also contains a drafted letter to my daughter Rachel, outlining a premeditated plan to have me involuntarily committed to a severe psychiatric facility on Monday morning. I was going to gaslight his own wife and lock me in a hospital to cover his underground gambling debts. I lowered the tablet and handed it directly to the lead federal agent. The agent took the device, his eyes fixed on the screen with a mixture of professional satisfaction and absolute disgust. He looked down at Trent, who was now staring at the marble floor, his entire body completely paralyzed. Trent had no more lies left to tell. The unedited 4K video and the intercepted network data had stripped him completely naked. Every single word of his pathetic hostage story had been instantly pulverized by irrefutable digital truth. "You thought you were the smartest person in the room, Trent?" I said, my voice low enough that only he and the agents holding him could hear. "You thought you could use my daughter as a bargaining chip and treat me like a disposable asset. But you forgot that I built my empire by anticipating every single move my enemies made. You did not walk into a business opportunity tonight. You walked into an incinerator, and I am the one who locked the doors." The federal agents hauled him roughly to his feet. He did not struggle. He did not say another word. His legs dragged across the marble floor as they marched him toward the exit. Marching him out of my house and out of my family forever. The heavy oak doors of the villa stood wide open, flanked by armed federal agents. The flashing red and blue lights from the courtyard cast a chaotic glow over the marble floors of my grand living room. I stood quietly near the floating glass staircase, watching the tactical teams process the arrested syndicate members. The air was thick with defeat. But the most difficult part of the night had not yet arrived. I had instructed my attorney Wallace to send a secure transport for my daughter Rachel the moment the raid commenced. I knew she had to see this nightmare with her own eyes. If I had simply told her over the phone, Trent would have found a way to plant seeds of doubt in her heart. She needed to walk into the center of his deception while the ashes were still smoldering. I heard the sound of tires crunching against the gravel of the driveway. A black luxury sedan pulled up behind the line of police cruisers. Wallace stepped out from the shadows near the entrance and opened the passenger door. Rachel emerged into the chaotic night. She was wearing a simple trench coat over her pajamas, her hair pulled back hastily. She looked around at the federal tactical vehicles and the heavily armed agents with a look of absolute bewilderment. She clutched her coat tightly around her waist as Wallace gently guided her up the stone steps and through the front doors. When Rachel stepped into the living room, the sheer magnitude of the betrayal hit her like a physical blow. She stopped dead in her tracks, her eyes wide with shock. She looked at the heavy titanium storm shutters sealing the windows. She looked at the professional casino tables erected over my Persian rugs. She saw the counting machines and the massive stacks of illicit $100 bills being bagged as evidence by the authorities. She saw the hardened criminals with their neck tattoos kneeling on the floor in handcuffs. This was the venue Trent had promised was hosting top-tier venture capitalists. This was the brilliant corporate retreat he had bragged about just a few hours earlier on the phone. Then her eyes found him. Trent was sitting on a nearby leather chair, his hands cuffed tightly behind his back. An agent stood directly behind him, keeping him secured. When Trent saw Rachel standing in the foyer, his twisted survival instinct flared up one final time. He ignored the federal agents and lunged forward slightly before being pushed back down. "Rachel," he cried out, his voice cracking with a desperate, pathetic whine. "Rachel, thank God you are here. You have to tell them who I am. You have to tell them this is a mistake. I was just trying to secure our future. Your father set me up, Rachel. He is losing his mind. He trapped me in here with these men. Please, baby, you have to help me." I did not let Trent poison her mind for another second. I stepped between them, positioning my body as a physical shield between my daughter and the parasite she had married. I looked at the federal agent guarding Trent and gave a brief nod. The agent hauled Trent to his feet and physically turned him around, marching him toward the exit and away from my child. Trent continued to scream, Rachel's name sobbing hysterically as they dragged him out the front doors and into the back of a waiting transport vehicle. Rachel watched him disappear into the night, her breathing shallow and erratic. She reached out and grabbed my arm, her fingers digging into my jacket. "Dad, what is happening?" she whispered, tears welling up in her beautiful eyes. "Why are these police here? Why is Trent in handcuffs? What did he do?" I wrapped my arms around her, pulling her into a tight embrace. I let her cry against my shoulder for a long moment, letting her feel the solid presence of her father. I knew the next 5 minutes were going to break her heart, but it was a necessary surgery to save the rest of her life. I pulled back gently, keeping my hands on her shoulders, and looked her directly in the eyes. "Rachel," I said, my voice soft but entirely firm, "I need you to be very brave right now. The man they just walked out of here is not the man you thought he was. He has been lying to you for a very long time." I guided her away from the chaotic center of the living room, leading her to the quiet corner of the mahogany bar. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out the digital tablet I had used to dismantle Trent's operation. I unlocked the screen and opened the encrypted dossier. I knew I had to be gentle, but I also had to be absolutely thorough. "Trent is completely bankrupt, Rachel," I explained softly, as I swiped through the financial documents. "His startup failed a year ago. He has been taking money from dangerous underground syndicates to fund your lifestyle and maintain his illusion of success. He owes them $500,000. Rachel shook her head, backing away slightly. "No, Dad, that is impossible," she stammered. "He works so hard. He showed me the projections. He told me the investors loved the software." I tapped the screen and played the audio file of his conversation in my study. I let her listen as her husband begged the syndicate boss for more time, offering my home as a secure staging ground for an illegal casino. I watched the blood drain entirely from Rachel's face as she recognized the desperate, cowardly tone of his voice. She heard him promise the criminals that she would not be a problem. She heard him barter her safety to save his own skin. "I did not bring investors here tonight, sweetheart," I said, setting the tablet on the counter. "He brought the syndicate. He promised to sign over the deed to this villa to wipe out his debts. But because he did not own the property, he had to find another way." I pulled up the high-resolution video from my private study. I stood beside her as we both watched the silent footage of Trent breaking into my locked filing cabinets with a brass letter opener. Rachel covered her mouth with her trembling hands, letting out a soft, choked sob as she watched the man she slept next to meticulously photograph my signature and my personal trust agreements. She was watching a complete stranger wearing her husband's face. "He forged my signature on a power of attorney, Rachel," I said, wrapping my arm around her waist to keep her steady. "He signed the house over to the crime boss just 10 minutes before the federal agents breached the doors. But that is not the worst thing he did." I swiped the screen to the final document. It was the drafted email I had intercepted from the wireless network. I hesitated for a fraction of a second, hating the fact that I had to show her this level of cruelty. But the poison had to be completely extracted. I pushed the tablet closer to her. "Read this," I told her gently. "He wrote this email to you an hour ago. He was going to send it to you tomorrow morning." Rachel leaned forward, her tear-filled eyes scanning the glowing text. I watched her read the words he had typed. I watched her process his elaborate lie about finding me wandering the halls, completely disoriented. I watched her read his fake apologies and his manufactured sorrow over my supposed rapid cognitive decline. I watched her read the final sentence where he suggested having me permanently locked away in a severe memory care facility for my own safety. When she finished reading, the tablet slipped from her fingers. It clattered onto the mahogany counter. Her legs gave out completely. I caught her before she hit the floor, lowering us both to the ground, holding her tightly against my chest. The illusion shattered completely into a million jagged pieces. The man she loved had not just stolen money. He had meticulously plotted to destroy her father, to strip away my sanity and my freedom, just to cover up his own miserable failures. He had planned to use her grief as a distraction while he looted her inheritance. "Dad," she gasped between heavy sobs, her fingers gripping my shirt. "He was going to put you in a hospital. He was going to take you away from me and tell me you were crazy." "I know, sweetheart," I whispered, resting my chin on top of her head. "I know. But he failed. I am right here, and I am never going to let anyone hurt you again." The weeks after the raid were filled with depositions, evidence reviews, court filings, and quiet financial triage. Trent had been removed from my home in handcuffs, but that did not mean anyone was entitled to skip the legal process that came next. The federal case moved first. Investigators already had the unedited surveillance archive, the recorded call from my study, the forged power of attorney, the quitclaim deed, the syndicate ledger, and the outgoing files Trent transmitted across my network. They also had the cash gambling equipment and financial records seized from the villa under the warrants obtained before the raid. The evidence did not make a conviction automatic, but it gave prosecutors a detailed chronology of what Trent had chosen to do. Wallace explained the charging posture to Rachel and me in his downtown office. Trent was facing federal fraud and forgery counts, conspiracy allegations, connected to the illegal gambling operation, and additional financial charges tied to the transfer scheme. If convicted on the principal counts, his exposure could be measured in years and potentially decades. The exact sentence would belong to a judge after the case was resolved. I did not need Wallace to predict a number. Trent had already lost the only thing he relied on most, the ability to control the story. His first defense was the same lie he tried in my living room. He claimed the syndicate had forced him to use the villa and threatened Rachel if he refused. The evidence contradicted him. The recording captured Trent bargaining for more time and offering my property as collateral. The study footage showed him breaking into my filing cabinet without an armed man anywhere near him. The document history showed when the forged papers were created and transmitted. The final video placed him at the table voluntarily signing the syndicate ledger after the boss accepted the forged deed. His attorneys could challenge individual pieces. They could argue context. They could test authentication. That was their job. What they couldn't do was make the sequence disappear. The court also entered financial preservation orders against accounts and assets. prosecutors alleged were connected to Trent's fraud and gambling activity. Wallace did not simply call a bank and freeze whatever he wanted. He provided Rachel's separate records, traced the legitimate sources of her property, and worked with investigators and the court to distinguish her finances from Trent's. That separation became our most important task. Rachel sat beside me through meeting after meeting, exhausted but fully engaged. She turned over the devices and records investigators lawfully requested. She identified the accounts she had never controlled, the business statements Trent had shown her, and the lies he used to explain his supposed startup income. Every answer was painful because it forced her to measure the marriage she believed in against the paper trail that actually existed. But each truthful answer also gave her back something Trent had stolen: control. Wallace built the financial firewall carefully. He documented which debts belonged to Trent, which transfers predated any joint use by Rachel, and which assets could be shown to have no connection to the illegal gambling proceeds. Where emergency protection was available, he sought it through the court. Where ownership was disputed, he preserved the records rather than pretending the dispute was already decided. The syndicate's private demands against Trent did not become Rachel's obligations simply because she was married to him. Neither did every allegation against Trent automatically contaminate my estate. That distinction was exactly why Wallace moved quickly. Rachel also filed for divorce. She did not ask me whether she should. She told me she was finished. That mattered more than any legal document Wallace could prepare. The woman who had once thanked me for helping Trent's fake investor retreat was now reading every page before she signed it and asking questions until she understood the answer. Wallace placed the dissolution case on the fastest lawful track available. He sought immediate protective orders where necessary, requested temporary control over disputed financial issues, and asked the family court to prevent Trent from using the divorce process to shift questionable debts onto Rachel. The final marital status could not be created by magic in a few weeks, and Wallace did not pretend otherwise. But the practical separation happened immediately. Rachel was no longer sharing accounts, accepting his explanations, or allowing him access to her finances. The court process would finish on the timetable the law required. Trent tried to reach her from custody. At first, he sent messages through counsel, claiming he had only been trying to protect her. Later came apologies, then blame, then another apology. Rachel made her own choice about those communications. She asked Wallace to route anything legally necessary through counsel and keep personal pleas away from her while she recovered. I did not burn letters behind her back or decide what she was allowed to read. She had spent too long being managed by a man who claimed to know what was best for her. I would not repeat that mistake in the name of protecting her. One afternoon, after another long meeting, Rachel closed a folder and looked at me. "I kept waiting for someone to tell me this was all a misunderstanding," she said. I waited. She shook her head. "It isn't." No tears came that time. The illusion had already broken at the villa. Now the paperwork was simply teaching her how large the break had been. The criminal case continued to build. Trent remained detained while the court reviewed the conditions of his case, the alleged fraud, and the risks raised by his connection to the syndicate. He was not serving a final sentence yet. He was a defendant facing a prosecution supported by evidence he had created with his own hands. Wallace told us not to measure justice by how quickly prison doors closed. "Measure it by whether the truth survives challenge," he said. That was enough for me. Weeks earlier, Trent had walked into my villa, believing he could convert my age, my property, and my daughter's trust into bargaining chips. Now every account he touched was being examined. Every forged document had an original beside it. Every lie had a recording, and Rachel was no longer standing behind him. When we left Wallace's office that evening, she took my arm as we stepped into the Monterey sunlight. She looked tired, but there was steadiness in her face I had not seen during her marriage. The legal annihilation was not a single dramatic stamp. It was the slow removal of every false protection Trent had built around himself. The criminal courts would decide his punishment. The family court would finish severing the marriage. The financial proceedings would determine which assets could lawfully be restrained or recovered. And Rachel would move forward with her life protected by evidence instead of promises. For the first time since Trent drove through my gates with 20 strangers, I no longer felt as though I was fighting him. The systems he had tried to manipulate were finally examining him without my help. My work had narrowed to one responsibility: make sure my daughter had a safe place to heal when she was ready to come home. 2 weeks had passed since the federal transport vehicles took my former son-in-law away into the dark coastal night. The physical restoration of my $5 million oceanfront villa began almost immediately, the very next morning. I hired a specialized private cleaning firm, instructing them to scrub every single inch of the property. I wanted every trace of the syndicate and every lingering shadow of Trent entirely eradicated from my sanctuary. They worked tirelessly for 3 days straight, moving with absolute professional precision. They polished the imported marble floors until they gleamed like glass, completely removing the scuff marks left by heavy tactical boots and cheap designer shoes. They professionally steam-cleaned the custom white leather sofas, lifting away the invisible stains of spilled whiskey and the foul odor of cheap cigars. I had the entire master suite repainted and the plush carpets completely replaced. I did not want to walk into my bedroom and be reminded of the arrogant boy who had bounced on my mattress and rummaged through my private life searching for property deeds. The scent of stale smoke and criminal desperation was finally replaced by the crisp, clean smell of lemon polish and the fresh, salty breeze blowing in from the Pacific Ocean. The fortress was clean again. It was pure. It was finally mine. Rachel stayed with me at the villa during those transitional weeks. She needed a safe harbor to process the absolute demolition of her marriage, and I was more than happy to provide it. The early days were incredibly difficult for her. I would often find her sitting quietly by the grand living room windows, staring out at the crashing waves with a look of profound emptiness. She was mourning a man who had never actually existed. She was grieving the loss of a future she had painted, with bright, optimistic colors, a future that had been secretly drawn over with a toxic black marker by a selfish coward. But day by day, I watched the incredible resilience of my daughter rise to the surface. She started taking long walks along the private beach, letting the cold ocean water wash over her feet and clear her mind. She began reading again, sitting in the sunroom for hours, immersed in the novels she had neglected during her stressful marriage to a phantom. The dark circles under her eyes slowly faded. The tension that had tightened her shoulders for the past year began to unravel. She was healing. The poison was leaving her system, and the strong, independent woman I had raised was slowly but surely returning to me. This morning, the coastal fog lifted early, revealing a spectacular clear blue sky. I woke up with the sunrise feeling a deep physical peace that I had not felt since the day I handed control of my logistics company over to my board of directors. I walked into the pristine kitchen and brewed a fresh pot of dark roast coffee. The quiet hum of the espresso machine was the only sound in the entire house. I poured 2 steaming mugs and walked out onto the expansive cedar deck. The automated titanium storm shutters were safely tucked away in their ceiling tracks, entirely invisible. The massive glass doors were wide open, letting the gentle morning warmth flood into the main living space. I sat down in my favorite wooden lounge chair, resting my mug on the small glass table beside me. A few minutes later, Rachel walked out onto the patio. She was wearing a comfortable, oversized sweater, her hair pulled back in a simple, loose knot. She looked rested. She looked completely at peace. She picked up the second mug of coffee and sat down in the upholstered chair next to mine. We did not speak immediately. We simply sat together in comfortable, familiar silence, watching a pair of seagulls glide effortlessly over the breaking white waves. The ocean was loud today, crashing heavily against the jagged rocks at the base of the cliff. It was a beautiful, relentless display of natural power that always made my problems feel incredibly small. Rachel took a slow sip of her hot coffee and let out a long, contented sigh. She turned her head and looked at me with a soft, genuine smile. She told me that she had finally slept through the entire night without waking up a single time in a cold sweat. She said her mind finally felt quiet and that the heavy, crushing weight on her chest was gone. I smiled back at her, feeling a massive burden lift off my own shoulders. I told her that she looked beautiful and that the coastal healing air was doing exactly what it was supposed to do. She reached across the small space between our chairs and rested her hand gently on top of mine. She thanked me. She did not just thank me for the coffee or the safe place to stay during the legal storm. She thanked me for protecting her. She thanked me for seeing the ugly truth when she was completely blinded by her own hopeful heart. She told me that she was ready to start looking for her own apartment in the city next week. She was ready to return to her career and begin the process of rebuilding her life entirely on her own terms. I squeezed her hand warmly, telling her that I was incredibly proud of her strength and that my doors would always be open whenever she needed a refuge. We sat there on the oceanfront deck for another hour, letting the morning sun warm our faces as the tide rolled in. The $5 million villa behind us was a magnificent piece of real estate. But sitting there with my daughter, I realized that the true value of my life had absolutely nothing to do with marble floors or infinity pools. My wealth was not measured in offshore accounts or property deeds or corporate stock options. My true legacy was the safety and happiness of my child. I had spent 40 years building a freight empire, fighting corporate sharks, and navigating treacherous financial waters. I had accumulated enough money to buy any luxury the world had to offer an old man. But the greatest return on my lifelong investment was the ability to deploy those resources to eradicate a terminal threat to my family. Trent had thought he could use my age and my wealth against me. He believed my money made me a soft target, a complacent old man waiting to be robbed in his sleep. He fundamentally misunderstood the nature of a lifelong provider. I did not accumulate power and resources to sit idly by while parasites fed on my loved ones. I built my fortress to withstand any storm, whether it came from the ocean or from inside my own hallway. The legal annihilation of my former son-in-law was a necessary surgery. It was harsh and it was brutal, but it excised a cancer that would have eventually killed my daughter's spirit and drained my legacy. He was currently sitting in a federal cell facing a dark future, dictated by steel bars and strict scheduled routines. He had lost absolutely everything because he tried to steal what he refused to earn through honest hard work. Rachel and I had moved past the anger and the initial shock of the betrayal. We were no longer victims of his elaborate deception. We were survivors who had successfully defended our home and our future. The smart home systems were functioning perfectly, silently monitoring the perimeter and ensuring our absolute security. The hidden cameras were still rolling, but there were no more criminals to watch. There were no more lies to intercept or fraudulent emails to decode. There was only the soothing sound of the ocean, the warmth of the morning sun, and the quiet, comforting presence of my daughter sitting safely by my side. The bitter conflict was permanently over. The dangerous parasite was completely removed. Through intellect, patience, and unyielding resolve, I had secured my legacy and protected my blood. The old lion had successfully defended his den against the wolves, and now it was finally time to rest. If there is one profound lesson this entire ordeal has taught me, it is that true family is never defined by legal documents or empty promises. It is defined by unwavering respect, unshakable loyalty, and the absolute willingness to protect one another from the cruelty of the world. Financial success can buy you a magnificent oceanfront fortress with impenetrable walls, but it cannot buy a moral compass, and it certainly cannot purchase genuine character. We often force ourselves to turn a blind eye to the glaring flaws in the people our children choose to love because we desperately want to see them happy. However, ignoring a toxic presence does not protect your family, It merely provides the parasite with enough time to drain them completely. True love sometimes demands that we be absolutely ruthless in our defense of the people we cherish most. You can never negotiate with raw greed, and you can never reason with a manipulator. You must expose the deception completely and cut it out by the very